hello, our viewers. I'm Nagesa Dube. Welcome to Duga Media. We have a guest today. Um, we're honored to have Peter Rachleff with us. Peter is the founding co-executive director of East Side Freedom Library. He taught labor, African American, and immigration history for more than 30 years, primarily at McMaster College and Metropolitan State University. So Peter has also two publications. And in today's interview, we will be exploring probably the challenge to democracy in Africa as well as in Ethiopia. We'll be exploring history, advocacy, and in general, he's here first time at Uga Media. Therefore, will be it's a kind of introduction as well as kind of informal conversation. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you, Nagesa. I'm so pleased to be able to be here. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you as well. I'm grateful that you appeared for a conversation here. Maybe if you have some additional thing to introduce, I'll give you like a few minutes. Did I introduce you well?
Yes, and I would just say that I consider myself to be a child of the 1960s here in the United States. I grew up at a time when the civil rights movement was very present, and movements against war were very present. And so, Nagesa, when you say we're here to talk about the challenge of democracy in Africa and Ethiopia, I would hasten to add we should be concerned about democracy in the United States, and that issues of democracy did not begin to be front and center with the election of Donald Trump in 2016 and the various things that happened after that. But democracy has been a challenge in the United States since millions of indigenous people were forced off their land and millions of African people were brought to the United States to work as slaves. And even after they got their freedom, the question of their citizenship and their participation in American democracy were continuously being raised. And so I grew up at a time when those issues were very powerfully being articulated by people like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Reverend Jesse Jackson, many people in local communities. And those struggles shaped me and made me want to better understand how we had gotten to where we were and how we might get to somewhere better. And ultimately, I decided that the study of history and the teaching of history was a way to get at those questions and educate additional generations of younger Americans, whether they were born in the United States or born elsewhere, to educate them as to the challenges and responsibilities that our history hands to us. So that's how I became who I am.
Wow, cool question. So you said you were part of no war movement.
Mm-hmm.
Which ones did you take part?
In the movement, particularly against the Vietnam War.
Okay.
But also, here we are marking the 50th anniversary of the overthrow of the Chilean government of Salvador Allende in 1973, a nefarious chapter in American history. I was certainly part of groups and movements in the United States that protested American involvement in overthrowing the democratically elected government in Chile. But we were also very concerned with America's involvement in Vietnam. And then, also over the next 20 years, the involvement of the United States in the government of South Africa and the support for that apartheid government that denied democracy and citizenship to the many diverse African peoples living at the southern end of the continent. So the United States involvement all over the world has been an important issue, and how we could have more democracy in the United States to prevent those kinds of negative interventions elsewhere in the world.
Great. Therefore, probably I wanted to share a little bit about the facilitations and our interaction in the past. Maybe you can talk about that. I can actually share maybe while we keep discussing.
Great.
Let me just directly go to the questions I have. We will be talking. You can take examples what happens in the United States and other nations. But my first question would be how you first come to learn about Ethiopia and the Oromo people. I mean, we met when you were a director at East Side Freedom Library. I participated in one of the conversations, and then we get acquainted, and we've been collaborating. You have been facilitating discussions for us, and I would like to know what sparked your interest in the history and the struggle.
So, first, I think I should explain about the East Side Freedom Library.
Sure. Great.
After 32 years teaching in an American college, I wanted to, in fact, my wife, who taught theater at the college, that she and I wanted to bring our skills and resources directly into our community, and not just educate formal college students, but to provide an educational context and opportunity to the increasingly diverse communities on the east side of St. Paul. And so we got this idea in 2013 to start this community project that we call the East Side Freedom Library. For my personal interests in Ethiopia, I have to admit that as a young white American, I first became aware of Ethiopia through the music of Bob Marley and the Rastafarians in Jamaica. And then because I am an intellectually inquisitive person, I pulled away the layers a little bit and said, well, who is this guy? Who was this Haile Selassie? And what was the place of Ethiopia in world history? And discovered that Ethiopia had been the major part of the continent of Africa that had never been colonized by the Europeans, that it had had its independence, and that as a result, Ethiopia, at least imaginatively, if not practically, had a central role in the ultimate liberation of people across the continent of Africa. And then at Macalester College, I was very fortunate to have an Ethiopian student who had come as a child to Minnesota. And she did a major research project on the place of Ethiopia in the imaginations of African Americans in the 19th century, and how when African Americans, both before and after the American Civil War, articulated a vision of freedom, Ethiopia was a place that they talked about. And so that became a second reason for my curiosity in Ethiopia. A good teacher learns from his students, and Sion Wold-Michael was an important teacher to me. Today, she is the executive director of President Biden's Committee on the Arts and Humanities. So she is impacting Americans way beyond this one white guy at Macalester College. But then when we began to dream about the East Side Freedom Library, we wanted to connect our new neighbors with our old neighbors, the white people who had lived here on the East Side for generations and were being challenged by macroeconomic change, what we came to call neoliberal globalization, that many of the blue-collar unionized jobs here on the East Side that had enabled white working-class people to become homeowners, to send their children to college, that those jobs were disappearing in the late 1980s and 1990s. And as those jobs were disappearing, many of those white people who were the descendants of immigrants from Sweden or Ireland or Germany or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, that they began to move away. And new immigrants began to move here on the East Side, whose lives were being disrupted at home by the same forces of neoliberal globalization. And so immigrants from Southeast Asia, Central America, and East Africa began to become the population here on the east side of St. Paul. And we were concerned that the white people who had remained were not welcoming their new neighbors. And we thought, in part because of my wife's work in theater and art, that we could use poetry, music, dance, visual art, film, storytelling as ways to bring our new neighbors and our older neighbors together, with the hope that they would discover that they actually had more in common than the dominant discourse in the United States would have led them to believe, that people were like each other. You know, Negesa, one of the most exciting things that happened at the Eastside Freedom Library was we had a panel discussion. We were hosting a display about treaties between the United States government and Native Americans, indigenous people, and how the United States government negotiated these treaties and then tore them up when it became convenient. And we had a panel of several Native Americans, and we had an Oromo speaker on the panel. And this Dakota scholar said at one point, we indigenous people believe the idea that you could own the land is as crazy as the idea that you could own your mother. And the Oromo guy on the panel leaned forward and looked at him and said, we believe the same thing. And this is magnificent, this recognition, this identification. And most Oromo people, I'm sure, came to the United States knowing nothing about indigenous history.
Correct.
Because that's not been part of the normal American history that gets taught and told. And so we want to be a place where those stories can be shared and those commonalities can be discovered. Then, of course, we began to discover that there isn't only one kind of Ethiopian people. but there are Amhara people and Anuak people and Tigrayans and Oromo people, and of course Eritreans, and so we saw that there were challenges internal to the Ethiopian presence, how to make one community. And one of the things that I was confident of as a historian is that throughout American history, immigrants had come to the United States, built new kinds of relationships with each other, and then sought to have an impact in the land that they had come from to build more solidarity,
Yep.
more democracy, more unity. And so that was something that I hoped that we would be able to promote and foster at the Eastside Freedom Library. And we started out with a group of Amharic poets who called themselves Rhythmic Literature. And we provided a space for them to recite their poetry in public, some speaking in Amharic, some speaking in English. And then after a couple of months, where they came once a month, we said, well, how about having an Oromo poet? How about having an Eritrean poet? How about having some poetry in Tigrinya? And they were happy to do that. And suddenly we had all these different Ethiopians now doing poetry and in the audience to listen to the poetry and to support each other and to share food and to realize how they were one people. And this is the work that makes me so happy and that makes me think a better world is possible when we can just take the time to have these conversations with each other.
Great. Yeah. Thank you very much. This idea of unity, idea of solidarity is very interesting, and I really appreciate that. And actually, that's one of the things I aspire a lot. I mean,
Yeah.
that peace should prevail, and then people should unite, love each other, help each other, but still there are challenges.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. And also, I have noticed that usually you have our emails and you share news articles related to Ethiopia. And can you tell us more about why you find this important and how it connects to your broader interest?
I think that the mainstream media in the United States, with Fox News at one end and CNN and MSNBC at the other, and the main networks in between, they paid very little attention to what goes on in the world unless it has immediate American interests. And they pay very little attention to what we call at the Eastside Freedom Library the stories that are in the shadows, the stories that are in the margins. And so I spend a lot of time receiving articles from all over the world, from lesser known podcasts and broadcasts and media, and then trying to be useful, I try to send them back out to people that I think probably are too busy to be looking. But if it pops up in the inbox, then they can take a look at it. And I don't always know that it's true, that everything, but it's important to see how people are talking about these issues. I've just been in a series of very interesting workshops on race and racism in the United States. And the person running these workshops, an African-American elder at the University of Illinois, Abdul al-Kalimat, pushes the idea that race does not really exist, that there is no biological basis for race. But other people in the workshop have said, but if people believe that race exists and they act on the basis of that belief, then we have to deal with it. It's not sufficient to say, oh, it's not real. And so we need to know what the government of Ethiopia is saying about what's happening in Amhara or the Tigray province or Oromia, or we need to know what the government is saying in order to be able to respond. And then we need to know what are people on the ground saying. I have been very, very fortunate the last couple months to become friendly with a young Sudanese guy who has just finished medical school here at the University of Minnesota. And he is suggesting all of this material for me to read about Sudan, which I've been ignorant about Sudan. And now I'm discovering all these complexities between people in Darfur and people in South Sudan and people in Sudan proper, and discovering, as in Ethiopia or as in Niger, anywhere, that the European and American colonial and neo-colonial powers have had a profound influence on shaping the way people think and structuring the ways people make a living. And so we cannot, the people in Ethiopia or Sudan or Niger or Mali or Burkina Faso, they're not going to be able to solve their problems on their own if Americans don't take more responsibility to influence the way our government or the French government or the German government or the British government, the ways that they are shaping education, thinking, making a living, the structure of the economy all across the continent of Africa. It needs to be addressed globally. It can't only be resolved in any one particular country.
So, some question came to my mind. I didn't prepare before. You see that there is a grouping called BRICS right now.
Yes.
The Brazil, Russia,
right.
India,
China. Yes.
China,
yes.
Yeah, and that grouping is also admitting new members.
Yes.
I want to know your view on that.
So there is tremendous debate in a small segment in the United States of people who identify as being on the left.
Okay.
And the debate is about, is there one imperialism or are there multiple imperialisms?
Okay.
And the Russia's invasion of Ukraine has really made many people here in the United States stop, reflect, debate. What is Russia's role? When we see the Wagner Group and their presence in many of the countries in the continent that have had coups, are they supporting this rapid defense group in Sudan? What role are they playing in Mali? And then we see what China is doing with their bridges and roads program, and in all cases, the search for primary materials. There's this very important new book that's just been published called Cobalt Red, about the mining of cobalt in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And so I regret to say that I am skeptical that BRICS is going to provide a better way forward than relying on the old imperialist powers from Europe or the United States. For a time, if we go back, for instance, to the Bandung Conference of 1955 and the emergence of the concept of the Third World, and we were reading Frantz Fanon and Walter Rodney and thinking about, in the Cold War, with the first world being the United States and the second world being the Soviet Union, was it possible for there to be a third way? Was it possible for the global South to build its own relationships and networks? I think it's possible that NATO on the one hand and BRICS on the other, that maybe room will open up in the middle, that rather than becoming a junior partner in BRICS, that Ethiopia and South Africa and Nigeria and Ghana and Jamaica and Trinidad, and that those countries might create their own path to development, a path to development that does not require tearing out the mineral resources and sending them to somebody else, that does not involve becoming impoverished miners and laborers on behalf of transnational corporations, rather than being able to do it in behalf of your own people in your own countries. And perhaps Ethiopia, if the relationships between the diverse ethnic groups of Ethiopia can build solidarity and unity and democracy, that can be a model for how Ethiopians and Sudanese, for how Nigerians and Zimbabweans, and how everyone can come together without continuing to make the United States or Great Britain or Russia or China rich. How can we enrich our own countries with our own human as well as material resources? Oh, I can't hear you, Negesa.
Sorry, I muted.
Very good.
I muted myself.
Yeah.
Going on your extensive expertise in history and social movements, as an outside observer, what do you see as some of the primary challenges facing Africa as a whole, with particular focus on Ethiopia, especially in terms of achieving peace, justice, and democracy?
Well, I think that I forget who it was who coined the phrase, we need to flip the script. And the script has been written even though Ethiopia was never colonized formally.
Yeah. Yeah.
The script to modernity, the script to development, the script to a life that has a healthy mix of work and leisure. That script was written by Europeans and Americans, and Africans need to write their own script. And we can go back to what did Patrice Lumumba have to say? What did Amilcar Cabral have to say? What did Kwame Nkrumah have to say? What did Haile Selassie have to say? We need to revisit that first generation of advocates of African liberation, and what were their visions for not just to throw the Europeans and the Americans out. What was their vision of a way to organize life in a healthy and productive way? And how do we begin to reconsider that? And the dominant script that was written by outsiders, so much of that script pitted people against each other. I'm very influenced by the scholar Mahmoud Mamdani. And Mamdani is ethnically South Asian, was born in Uganda, was chased out of Uganda with his people by Idi Amin, became a scholar, taught at the University of Cape Town and then Columbia University in New York, and now has returned to Kampala University in Uganda.
Okay.
And Professor Mamdani has written a book called Neither Native Nor Settler. And he opens with a chapter about what was done to Native Americans in the United States and how Native Americans were pitted against each other competitively and militarily. And then he goes on to talk about other countries, including, this is what began to get me interested in Sudan even before the violence has broken out again. And he says, this idea that there are Arabs and Nubians in Sudan. He said that was created by the British. And then it was manipulated by the Turks. And then the Egyptians were used to enforce those divisions. And now we see the same groups fighting against each other again, being manipulated. So we need to purge ourselves of those frameworks that had been imposed and begin to develop our own indigenous frameworks. And my work here on the east side of St. Paul has inspired me that people develop ideas. Knowledge, we like to say, knowledge is not created only in the academy. Knowledge is created in communities, and we need to honor that knowledge and bring that knowledge forward. And I'm confident that people will solve their own problems if people like me can help prevent the interference that the dominant global North countries, and now I fear that China, India, and Russia will play a similar role. We need to be very cautious.
So you mean the challenge is with the script?
Yeah.
Major challenge.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Well, and I think there's just this last week.
Yeah.
A wonderful interview with Ngugi wa Thiong'o was published by the London Review of Books. And Ngugi's ways of thinking are so emancipatory, eye-opening, and his insistence on writing in his native language rather than writing in English. And these thinkers are all around. We just need to open our eyes and ears to them, and our hearts.
Great, thank you very much. And next, recently you have brought to our attention reports of human rights violations, including incidents such as rape in Tigray, killings of Ethiopian immigrants by Saudi guards, and recent coups in Africa. Could you please share your insights and perspective on the troubling developments?
Well, I think that, it's obvious from a human rights perspective that this behavior is terrible, and that we need to condemn this behavior and try to discourage it wherever we can. But I think that as a historian, I try to think about the present historically. And I think that we're living in a very significant time of change, where the power of the United States is decreasing in the world. The power of countries like Russia and China and India is growing. That the global economic system, that it has been capitalist all along, but the forms of capitalism have changed. And so for a long time, Keynesianism was the dominant form of capitalism, and it meant that the government played a major role in promoting economic growth and subsidizing economic growth, and the idea of promoting demand was a way to generate growth. And then, in the 1970s and into the 1980s, that system really broke down and became replaced with this system of neoliberalism that, rather than focusing on demand, economic behavior should focus on the cost of supply. How do we make everything cheaper? How do we get minerals from South America or East Africa? How do we make everything cheaper? And how do we make labor cheaper? And that became the orthodoxy from the 1980s with the elections of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. That was the dominant economic system from the 1980s to the first decade of the 21st century. But I think that the financial crisis of 2008 to 2010 and the consequences in the decade of the 2010s, and now what we've seen in the pandemic, have shown us that neoliberalism as a way of organizing the world economy, that it too has now run out of steam. And the question is, what will replace it? Not just who will replace the powers. Will we simply replace the United States with China? But what kind of system will replace it? And a system that is focused on making things cheap is not a way that is going to make people's lives better. So, I think back to Nkrumah and Nkrumah's concept of Ujamaa. How do we build the community? How do we build togetherness? How do we, as Paul Wellstone, the senator from Minnesota who died tragically in a plane crash, as Paul Wellstone said, we all do better when we all do better. So, it sounds simplistic, but how do we create structures and reward practices and behaviors that recognize that when people in Oromia do better, people in Minnesota will do better. When people in South Sudan do better, people in Minnesota will do better. My life will not get better by making other people's lives worse. And I think that the climate crisis that we're living through is such evidence of that storms begin in one part of the world and then suddenly California is a disaster. Wildfires break out in Canada and terrible air comes into the United States. That we are all connected. And so we will all do better when we find ways for all of us to do better.
That's amazing explanation. That's what we lacked.
Yeah.
We think if David gets something, I lose.
Right.
And
yes.
That's wrong. If David gets something, that means I'm getting it.
Yes.
It doesn't mean that I'm losing something.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So people should get that concept.
And so much of the racial thinking that and ethnic thinking that has been promoted, it takes that jealousy and makes that jealousy energized. And this is our challenge in the United States, to not just to prevent Trump from becoming president again, but but to address why millions of people identify with his way of thinking. Another old saying in 1926, an African American historian named Carter Woodson published a very important book titled The Miseducation of the Negro. I now like to take that and talk about the miseducation of all Americans. We have all been miseducated to be jealous of others, to feel threatened by others, to think that for us to get it, someone else must not. So I'm glad that I've devoted my life to education, and I can intend to continue to do so.
And so you make me remember something. There is a book I read by Dr. Cross. He talks about identity development, ethnic identity development. So he puts a stage like pre-encounter, encounter, immersion, and what are those? Commitment and commitment. What's it? Something. There are 5 states. So, I don't know if you're aware of this states, but
it sounds like a book in psychology, perhaps, which is not a field that I study very much.
Yeah. The study mostly focuses on the African American, like Negro. So he puts how this self-consciousness develops, identity, ethnic identity develops over time. So especially the dangerous one is when some at the level of immersion. Actually, even the first the pre-encounter one is totally lost of his identity. Doesn't want his identity or totally accepted the narrative from the other side. But some encounters, some situation would awaken him and start looking for the Black history, Black identity, Black music, and started to appreciate everything Black. But at this moment, at this stage, he hates the others. He feels the others are evil. And this is good. His side is good and the other is evil. And there are stages at which he starts to accommodate, okay, not everything me is good. Not everything Black is good. There are evil in Black as well. And there are good and the others side also. And he started to, okay, what can I do now? Instead of like, at that level, he doesn't only blame the white and the others, right? He even blames some Blacks who doesn't think like him. He can't accommodate difference in ideas, like, and probably I see that we, especially in Ethiopia, I mean, the same kind of like thing in which the majority are in this at this immersion stage, authorizing the other side and not understanding, and even not benefiting the group one belongs to. That saying, because instead of you write your history, you maybe try to develop the language, you try to help in whatever profession you have, you focus on others. You see that? I mean, I see that we're in that situation. But this is. Let me get back to the questions I have for you. So, as an expert in this field, what specific initiatives or actions do you believe can help foster peace and reconciliation in Ethiopia, given the complex historical and political factors involved?
Well, I think that the the Ethiopian diaspora, whatever ethnic origins any family, any individual may have, the Ethiopian diaspora can be a place to model solidarity and unity and cultural as well as political democracy. So we can celebrate each other's cultures. We don't have to find some amorphous, flat meeting ground. We can continue to celebrate our language, our poetry, our music, our art, our ways of thinking, while recognizing what we have in common. And then, and this is an idea that I have from my years of studying other immigrant groups. What did the Irish do in the United States? What did the Germans do? I spent a long time studying Croatian immigrants, people who came from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and where they had been taught to hate Serbians and hate Bosnians and hate Herzegovinians. And in the United States, they came together. And then they looked back at where they had come from and said, well, why couldn't it be like that at home? And when the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed in 1914 with World War I, and Yugoslavia was created as the land of all the South Slavic peoples, immigrants who had come to the United States went back to Yugoslavia to have an impact on shaping a democratic government, which worked for many generations until the 1980s. But it's an experience that deserves more attention. The role that immigrants played going back, and the kind of political and cultural democracy that was created. And I think that it's possible for diverse Ethiopians to play those roles today in Ethiopia and in East Africa. It's possible for diverse Sudanese who have come to the US to play that role and help bring peace and democracy to their homeland. In most cases, people still have loved ones back in the land that they came from, and their loved ones would have much better lives if peace and democracy were the case. Immigrants don't just shut their eyes to what continues to happen in the land that they came from. They're not just selfish and looking forward to how can they make their own personal lives better here, but what can they do for their families and communities back home? And so I don't know much about Ethiopia, but what I know about Ireland and Yugoslavia and other places makes me think certain ways about what could be possible in Ethiopia.
Yeah, the diaspora somehow was helpful for like making voice for people back home.
Yeah.
And supporting some struggle, and also every diaspora supports his family, so that's a great help. However, the other problem that we have is every group from every ethnic group. There are differences in way of thinking, way of political thinking, how Ethiopia should be in the future. There is a difference what in history, I mean, how we understand history, the way an Oromo elite understands on the formation of Ethiopia and the past regions, It's not the same as the way Amara elite understands it and Tigray elite understands it. There is a difference on the current Ethiopian governmental structure, like the federal structure, the constitution. I mean, there are people who want us to totally scrap the constitution and we have to write a new constitution. Mm-hmm. There are people who say, oh, this is a base at least. We may amend, but we should stick on this one. So there are this like polarization all over among the ethnic elites. But so though the diaspora has a good opportunity because the diaspora is living in a better world, in a better countries economically, and maybe have freedom as such, but we're weak at looking for solutions, like coming together and try to figure out what, like accommodating the differences and debate. And we don't have that. Every group tries to win over the others by mobilizing its group, by raising funds and support maybe guerrilla fighters back home. So the Tigray group supporting the TPLF, and the Amhara supporting the fund or raise fund, the Oromo support the OLA, Oromo Liberation Army, raise money, and not every, but some. And so there is people do not come together, try to figure out and like come to the middle ground and okay, you guys need this, or you guys have this view. We don't accept that view, but how about we agree on this? Yeah. You know, there has to be discussion. So the diaspora has a lot of impact on people back home. The people back home are living together, but the diaspora in a free world, even sometimes they don't want to talk to each other. We're not trying to figure out where the problem lies. We're not working hard to understand each other. Had the people in the diaspora who lives in the United States come together and talk, a lot of problems could have been solved. And that can make a very good foundation for new Ethiopia. We could impact a lot, but the problem, that's what we have been trying. Even using the East Side Freedom Library, we're trying to bring people together, discuss, talk. At that moment, most people think, oh, the Ethiopian situation, we have a good government and things are in a good direction. And if one group thinks the government is on his side or pursuing his way of thinking, he will just give support, and it doesn't, try to accommodate the other group. But we had this fear, we potential civil war. If you remember, the one of the topic of discussion is how we can save Ethiopia from potential civil war. That time, nothing has happened, but from the discussions, from what is going on, we anticipated it happened. Conflict in Tigray happened. Now with Amhara is going on. Within Oromia, there is this thing going on because first there was euphoria. Everybody was happy that this angel came. The prime minister was, depicted as an angel, some Moses, everybody, But right away, the expectation is now there are a lot of things, that even expected from people, So when the expectation is not met, then conflict start to happen. And anyways, thank you for your suggestion and recommendation. And finally, what advice would you offer to young scholars and activists and who are interested in pursuing research and advocacy in the fields of in different fields, and also regarding the situation in Ethiopia? Maybe my focus is mostly.
Well, I mean, first I want to say, Negesa, that we all have to to do what we can where we are. Your work in media, you're creating a space where conversations can take place. My work at the Eastside Freedom Library, creating a space where conversations can take place. We have to be role models of being good listeners as well as good speakers. We want to show other people that we have respect for the people that we listen to and invite into our space. Even if we disagree with them, we can still respect them. So, all of us who have the privilege of having access to a physical space like I have, a virtual space like you have, we have to make that space as welcoming and encompassing as we can. I think of, and I don't remember the gentleman's name who came to the U.S. and went back to Ethiopia, and he had a ferocious media presence. And
okay, yeah.
Yeah. So that's not a good model. How do we make our space welcoming? I think to young people, it's to realize that knowledge is produced in communities as well as in academia. Find the elders in your community. Encourage them to tell you their stories. Make sure that their stories do not disappear. Keep those stories alive. There is much wisdom in those stories. Find people to read with. I love saying, when I went to college, I started college in 1969. For the 4 years that I was in college, not only did I take classes, but I was always in a reading group with other people, with my peers. And we would have good arguments about what we should read next and what did we think about what we had just read. But we were always interacting with each other. And so that's complicated, to look for elders and also find peers. And then, thirdly, take the responsibility to encourage those that are even younger than you, how to be a student and a teacher at the same time. And so teach your younger brothers and sisters, teach the younger children in your community, model for them how to be a learner and a knowledge producer, and ultimately a responsible human being. And I think if we all aspired to be responsible human beings, the world would be a much better place.
Thank you very much. And maybe there is one question from our audiences.
Yes.
So it says, good question, Mr. Peter. Good discussion. Mr. Peter, what do you think are the major challenges Ethiopia faces to plant democracy, and what have you suggested as a way out of current hostilities? Any international experience you want to share?
Well, again, I would say take Paul Wellstone's watchword. We all do better when we all do better. And ask, what am I doing today that will make other people's lives better? And how can I understand that then coming back to me? So what economic steps, political steps, cultural steps, what can we do to make other lives better? It will come back to make our lives better. And that's between the diaspora and people living in Ethiopia. That's among the different groups in Ethiopia. And ultimately, that's between Ethiopia and its neighbors, how to build those relationships that are not competitive, but collaborative.
Thank you very much. I think I'm out of my questions.
Okay.
I know that we can have a lot of discussion more. We can take more time, but we don't have much time right now. I would like to know if you will be part of our conversation in the future.
And invite me anytime, Nagesa. I'm very happy to. Yes.
Thank you. Hopefully, you will be family of Uga Media, and we
Thank
learn
you.
a lot from you. Thank
Well,
you for being here.
and I've learned a lot from you and from your community. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a wonderful time.
Okay.
All right.